Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Hope everybody is doing well. September is upon us. 8 months of the year are down, 3 months left, and for the tech industry, this is a busy time of year. I think, we have sort of two busy times a year. There's sort of spring announcements and events and trade shows, and then we've got fall announcements and trade shows. And this is the time of the year when you're seeing a lot of companies, a lot of announcements, coming out. Whether it's sort of the second half of the year shows. You've got CNCF's got an event, AWS reInvent late in the year. You've got the holidays, so you've got a lot of interesting dynamics happening in terms of companies trying to finish their projects for the year, companies trying to figure out budgets for the next year. They're already into planning cycles and so forth. So this is a very, very interesting time of the year. September sort of kicks it off. The weather starts to get a little cooler. So what we're going to do today is we're going to dive into an aspect of the industry that I think is very, very prevalent and very well known, or at least well visible, highly visible, if you will. But we don't always kind of dive into, what happens behind the scenes. How does it work? And that's, how do some of the largest analysts, in this case, we're going to dive into an interesting conversation with our friends at Gartner. How do they go about thinking about some of the really big challenges that companies have? So the companies that consult with them, that interact with them, not so much consult with them, but use them as guidance for trying to figure out their big challenges, their big technology decisions, their technology evaluations, trying to figure out trends versus hype and all that sort of stuff. And today we get a chance to really, for a nice long interview, dive into what's their process, how do they go about thinking about big picture challenges that companies have, how do they go about trying to convey that to companies in a way that helps them understand both short-term challenges, long-term challenges. So really kind of excited to dig into this. I know we talk about the analyst and magic quadrants and all sorts of things all the time, but really going to have a really good in-depth conversation about how they kind of go through their rationale for, helping companies and also, helping as they work with different vendors sort of, understand their messaging. And so how they're learning as well as companies are learning and so forth. So we're going to dive into that after the break. And we're back. Folks, this is welcome back to the Cloudcast. I'm your host, Brian Gracely. And, one of the things that we are always looking to do on the show is try and look at all the different ways in which we are engaging around technology, in which we learn about technology, how we use technology, especially around the cloud. And one of the things that maybe we don't talk about enough, but is a reality for so many companies, whether they're mid-sized companies, larger companies, is they're trying to figure out as they look at their business needs and they look at the technology that's potentially available to them to go solve those business needs, is trying to figure out, am I making the right choice? Am I making the right short-term choice? Am I making the right long-term choice? As most of us do, we try and take in the best information we can, the most information we can. But oftentimes it really helps to, have ways to engage with other companies, with independent experts and people that can give you a perspective that you may not necessarily get if you're getting bombarded by vendors or you're just reading the media or whatever it might be. And so we thought it'd be very interesting today to really dig into not only the type of topics that we talk about all the time, cloud and DevOps and automation and the things that we know you all really are interested in, but really kind of dig into what's the perspective that is coming from the leading analyst firms? In this case, we're going to talk to Gartner. How do they look at the world? How do they talk to their clients about the decision-making process that they have to make, in which they're spending very, very large amounts of money for decisions that are going to make impact over many, many years. So really excited today to have Paul Delory, Research Vice President from Gartner Technical Professionals, joining us today. Paul, great to have you on the show. Really excited to be speaking with you today.
Brian, thank you very much. Appreciate it. A long-time listener, first-time caller.
Thank you. We appreciate that. We're going to dig into a whole lot of different topics. We're going to kind of go all over the place today. But before we dig into any of those, give folks a little bit of your background. Both, you've got a very distinguished background of practicing, but working with a lot of companies. But give some folks your background, and then some of the areas that you're really focused on these days.
Yeah, I'm happy to do it. My name's Paul Delory. I'm a research vice president here with the Gartner for Technical Professionals research group. That means from where I sit in Gartner, I advise engineers and architects. So my remit here in the firm is to get into the technical details, really understand the nuts and bolts, and be able to advise people at an engineering architecture level. A lot of people don't realize that Gartner offers that service, but we do. I'm here. I exist. I have many colleagues in the group as well. That is my background. I was a VMware engineer primarily. I was a virtualization guy, so I came up running VMware and Citrix, neither of which exists as an independent company anymore.
Right.
But I have about a decade of real hands-on keyboard experience in the data center prior to coming to Gartner. So my coverage area here, primarily I do talk about automation and DevOps. That is my focus area, and that's always been kind of my primary interest. But I spend a lot of time talking about cloud infrastructure, data center infrastructure, and lately I have been spending a whole lot of time talking about VMware.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah.
I know from working with your group, maybe not you specifically, but the folks within your area. Oftentimes, like you said, you guys come from technical backgrounds, you come from practitioner backgrounds, and it's often interesting. If I'm speaking to the team, sometimes from a vendor perspective, how much and how in depth you guys know about the products, and in some cases more than the vendors do themselves, because you've been, both analyzing it, but also, talking to a lot of companies that are using it in ways that are probably very different than the PowerPoint slides and the keynotes and other things do. So I'm excited to dig into some things today. Let's start with cloud. It's part of the name of this show, and like you said, it's an area you cover because nowadays you're talking about DevOps or automation is going to hit cloud at some point in time. I want to talk about a little bigger picture. Over the last decade or so, everybody was sort of the belief that the cloud providers were cheaper. They would tell you that they're cheaper than IT, but yet when we came out of COVID, there was a lot of talk, both anecdotally from in the press and seeing companies talk about it, but you also saw the cloud providers saying, "Hey, we're seeing some slowdowns because people are rationalizing their spending, or they're not maybe keeping as many copies of data or whatever." Where do you how do you view that these days? We're a decade into sort of cloud computing, the evolution from sort of data centers. How do you view that in terms of how people are kind of coming to rationalize the cloud, especially from a from a cost perspective, not purely a technology, but a cost perspective? Is it as simple as like one's cheaper than the other, or where do you find people get confused about how to evaluate the cost or the value of private cloud versus public cloud?
Yeah, I gave a talk at our IOCS conferences last year called "Yes, the Public Cloud is Cheaper Than Your Data Center." So I think my position on this is on the record, pretty much. But yes, I do think that in the vast majority of cases, public cloud is going to be cheaper overall. There are exceptions, but as I say all the time, you're probably not one of them.
Yep.
But it's funny. Every time I give a talk like that, the first thing I do is I ask for a show of hands from the audience. Who thinks the public cloud is cheaper? And every time I've asked that question, it's been split about 50-50.
Yeah.
Right. You've got 50% of the room saying cloud is cheaper, 50% saying data center is cheaper, and both sides think the other side is crazy.
Yep.
Like, what are you talking about? Right.
Right.
So oftentimes what I do is I really want to explore, why do people think the data center is cheaper? And it does come down to misconceptions. There's kind of half a dozen misconceptions that I go through in the talk, but there's two real big ones that I'll highlight for you here. Number one, in a lot of cases, people are making the wrong comparisons, and we end up kind of talking past one another, right? Almost always when you're having this conversation, the only thing that anybody wants to talk about is lift and shift. The only thing that anybody wants to say is it cheaper to rent a virtual machine from a cloud provider or host my own virtual machine on-prem?
Yep. Makes sense.
That is too narrow of a conversation, right? A hyperscaler like AWS, like Azure, like Google, they offer 200 plus services. And as I often tell people, you don't compete with probably 196 of them. right?
Yep,
I mean,
fair
you're
enough.
talking about technology that is not in your data center. So for a lot of cloud workloads, this comparison isn't even possible. It doesn't even make sense
Sure.
because you're talking about a technology that isn't in your data center, right? So I want to get people out of the mindset of, the only thing a cloud provider does is rent virtualization versus buy virtualization, right? So that I think is one problem. The other major problem that I see all the time is people grossly underestimate how expensive it is to run stuff on-prem. And I think they do a bad job with that analysis. And I have sympathy for this because that's actually a tough analysis to make. It's a complicated question, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And what ends up happening is how much the cloud costs because you get a bill every month, right? And you are comparing a very concrete number that you get from your provider to this cloud of, kind of hazy assumptions. And there wind up being some problems there. I'll give you an example. My last shop that I worked at before I came to Gartner, we had a question that came down from very high up that said, how much does 1 gigabyte of storage cost us? Right? Because you've got some executive in the business that's trying to calculate a cost of goods sold, and they're trying to see how much data do we store? What does that cost? They need a number,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
And we set about to get them that number, but that's actually really hard, right? So we've got a bunch of storage arrays, and it's not like we went down to the storage array store and bought a storage array and we have a receipt. That's a very big system. It's very complex. It was built over time. So we bought a bunch of disk shelves and a bunch of controllers and a bunch of disks at various points in time, and we paid various different prices for that. So the first thing that we had to do is we had to send the data center operators running around, writing down the serial numbers on all the disk shelves and all these components and try to cross-reference them against the purchase order to figure out what did we pay for this, right? Like what was the actual price? And now you get into things like how much electricity does that use, right? Well, were we really tracking that? No, probably not. What is the network bandwidth that's coming out of the storage array? Is anybody sit down and look at the numbers? How much does it cost us in engineer salaries? Well, it depends on the engineer and it depends on the geo. And are we going to dig through service center tickets and figure out, how many times somebody repaired something in this array? No, you're not going to do that, right? You're going to fudge those numbers. 5 minutes into that meeting, you're going to, start estimating and doing all of this stuff. And what winds up happening is you leave a lot of costs out. And you wind up making your operational costs for that on-prem infrastructure seem like they're a lot lower than they actually are. And that is a big part of the problem here.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I think what you're highlighting, and again, it's like you said, that there's going to be scenarios in which, like you said, 50% of the room is going to think I'm more expensive. 50% of the room is going to say it's less expensive. And I think what you're sort of highlighting is that you can debate either side of that, and you can have strong opinions on it. But the reality is, like, the ability to even just get to a point where you can compare things apples to apples is so complicated. Like, you could be talking about power and cooling. You could be talking about space in a data center. And somebody might come along and say, like, well, yeah, but you have to understand that, this is the way we depreciate the data center. This is the tax credit that we get from the state for having the building in this location. Like, exactly. You can get into a bunch of things that you're like, dude, I just want to know what the price of a gigabyte is. Like, why are you making this so complicated? Why are you comparing things that, that data center, facilities group doesn't even live in the IT organization. It's just a building we rent, or, you can get into a lot of different things like that. So yeah, it does sort of highlight, I think, the challenges we have between even just the simplest things of, like, are you running this thing for a long time, in which case you're probably going to have a certain sort of steady state and cost, or like, are you trying to do an experiment for a month in which like trying to compare it to on-prem makes no sense whatsoever, because you can't rent a storage array for a month. You got to buy it and depreciate it over 3 to 5 years.
Absolutely. I 100% agree with that. The way that I frame this is I say, you really have to build an economic model.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to build a fairly sophisticated economic model of your data center to even be able to answer this question. Now, by the way, we help with that all the time. My colleague, Ange Troy, has a great paper on data center cost modeling. And it's got this big, long spreadsheet where you can plug in all of these costs and you can, get a real number. And we fill in, we track IT key metrics very closely. So for stuff like for stuff like operator salaries, we actually have default values that we track that we can fill in. Her spreadsheet is fantastic. You know what the number one response to that spreadsheet I hear is? Oh, this is too much. I'm not filling all this in.
That's right. That's
right. Because there's like 200 data points that you have to collect. And I'm sorry, but it's complicated.
Yeah.
So if I could say one thing, I think what people need to do is if you're building an analysis like that, and this is kind of accounting 101, right? But you need any kind of cost analysis, you need two documents. You need an income statement, and then you need a balance sheet. Right. And again, this is accounting 101. But the purpose of the balance sheet is to make sure that your inputs match your outputs. So when you build an economic model and you say it costs me X dollars per server to run, okay, X dollars times the number of servers you have should match your data center budget. And if it doesn't, then you screwed up and you haven't captured all of your costs. That's the balance sheet analysis that you need to do. And I think in a lot of cases with a lot of these analyses that I see, if you did that, you would say, hey, I'm adding up all of my servers and I'm only getting to 40% of my data center budget that my CIO gave me. And I hope that, at that point you have to realize somehow I'm leaving 60% of my costs out of this analysis.
Yeah.
And you've got to go back and revisit it, right? So that's kind of like a basic check that I would do, but people simply don't do that. And let's be honest, sometimes this analysis gets done in bad faith.
Sure. Yeah. No. Right? Sometimes people go into it and they go, this is the answer that I want to happen. So let's make the numbers, work in that direction.
There is some of that. Yes.
Yeah. I want to shift gears a little bit, not so much, totally different domain. We're going to sort of say in the data center. We've talked about this a lot on the show, but I'm very curious, again, from an independent perspective, how you think about this, because I feel like this is probably a topic you're getting a lot of phone calls about. We're obviously for the last year or so, we've all read the headlines about the VMware changes, whether they're licensing changes, product changes, bundling changes because of the Broadcom acquisition. It feels like a situation in which, there's been a lot of public wrangling. Certain companies will come out and say, we're frustrated about this, or companies will say, hey, we're exploring alternatives. VMware is such a big part of what, of people's data centers, right? It's sort of been there for more than a decade. How do you even go about starting to frame a conversation with people? Because I'm sure there's a part of it that's very technical, a part of it that's emotional. Sometimes somebody gets a big bill like that and goes, this is totally unprecedented. Like, how do you even go about rationalizing and framing that big of a decision as you're talking to people?
That's the right question to ask. This is a business problem for a lot of people, more so than a technology problem. Mm-hmm. And first of all, you're absolutely right. We are being inundated with calls on this. I personally am taking multiple calls a day from Gartner clients on VMware alternatives, and I'm one of 20 plus analysts who covers VMware. So the call volume across Gartner is very, very high. A lot of people are very upset with VMware. The peasants are at the castle gate with torches and pitchforks over this one, right? A lot of folks are upset about price increases that they're seeing. They are upset about the bundling. VMware has eliminated a lot of the old licenses that they used to have. They're trying to shoehorn in everybody into VMware Cloud Foundation or maybe VMware vSphere Foundation. Right. But in both cases, they're bundle SKUs that include vSAN, that maybe include NSX or ARIA or other parts of the VMware suite. And, a lot of people aren't using those. and they feel like they're being asked to pay for software that they're not using. So that's part of the concern here too. The question that most people come to me with is, what are the alternatives to VMware, and how do I migrate to a VMware alternative? And we can have that conversation. I'm happy to do it. I will totally geek out on the differences between VMware and Nutanix, or VMware and Hyper-V, or, hey, how about OpenShift virtualization, right?
Yeah,
So I'm totally happy to do that. But at the end of the day, I think that's the wrong question to ask. I think the question that people should be asking is, how do I modernize my application portfolio, right? How do I move to containers? How do I move to cloud? How do I move to serverless? That's what people should be trying to do, more so than how do I get a different hypervisor and kind of be the same.
Yeah.
And I know that's a tough conversation, right?
Well,
I mean,
and it's it's one of those things that like you said, you could go and dig into all the details of, a Nutanix or an OpenShift or a, Azure Stack or any of those things. And you're going to reach a point where you make a bunch of spreadsheets and a bunch of checkboxes, and then you're going to have some that you go, well, if I compared this feature and that feature, this one's, slightly better. But it's like you said, at some point, if you step back to it and you say, look, let's say we're considering an alternative, right? We're open to an alternative. The question you almost have to, just the most basic question you have to ask yourself is like, it's going to cost me something to move, right? Or to make this transition,
Absolutely.
right? It's whether it's in people skills, whether it's in engineering around potential downtime or whatever it might be. And you almost have to ask yourself, like, if I'm going to go through all that work and the end result is I'm just going to have a bunch of virtual machines that, the underlying bits underneath them are just different. But at the end of the day, it's still a Windows machine or Linux machine. You kind of ask yourself, like, why is that really what we want to go through? And I like the way that you frame it as, it's how would I modernize from here? Because there are alternatives that are, sort of leave you in the same place. But is that really where you want to be for whatever you're going to spend to get there?
Brian, I say that all the time, right? There is a certain level of re-engineering that you're going to have to do.
Yep.
And if you accept the premise that you're going to have to do re-engineering and you're going to spend that time and money and effort, wouldn't it be better to spend time, money, and effort modernizing your application portfolio rather than moving toward another hypervisor where, in the best case scenario, it's exactly what you have today. That's the best case, right? And you're basically running on a treadmill. Do you want to do that? I will say though, and again, this is my practitioner experience talking. When I think about my career as a VMware admin, in most cases, the job that I was asked to do was, hey, we bought this piece of software off the shelf. You need to build a VM and install it in this VM and run this software that we bought. Right. So that type of environment looks very, very different. And you can tell people you should containerize that, or you should do whatever. But their answer is going to be, I didn't write this software, I bought it. Right. And there's a question of what the vendor supports.
Yeah.
A big problem. Yeah.
Yeah. You may just want I just want a server underneath it, man. Don't make my life any more complicated than I need to.
Absolutely. And the software vendor may not know. Right. There's a lot of cases where support is a problem. This software is supported on VMware, but you ask them, is this supported on Nutanix? And the vendor says, what's a Nutanix?
Right.
You know what I mean? They don't even know. And it's not a question of, does it run? It's a question, because yes, it will run, but it's a question of, does the vendor support it? And you don't want to be in an unsupported state.
Right.
So I do recognize that, I do think the right thing to do is to have a conversation about the application portfolio, but we also need to address the long tail of legacy applications that's out there. The upshot of all of this is, I think where most of the clients that I talk to land is that they're going to try and minimize their VMware footprint. They realize that they're going to have some VMware, but they're going to try and minimize that footprint and, move what they can. That's pretty much where everybody's ending up.
Yeah, I feel like that's, for the conversations that I'm privy to, and again, we don't have to go into lots of details of it, but yeah, that does feel like it is there's a sense of, we probably have to keep some for various reasons, but what can we additionally do, and sort of start to think about the realities of, like, okay, what if I have this sort of bifurcated thing, and And it's one of those things where if somebody goes, oh, well, in the past I didn't have multiple systems, and you kind of go, yeah, but you probably did, right? Like before you ran SAP on top of VMware, before you ran the most critical Oracle databases, like you had a separate system. So this isn't like the first time that, IT organizations have been like, okay, I'm going to have to manage multiple systems. And at that point, then you start to, you really kind of get into the economics of, what does that mean and how many people can do it and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, I'm not surprised by you saying this has been sort of top of mind. It feels like it's something that, probably has a 1 year to 2 year sort of window that people are going to make decisions of like, am I still 100% committed to it? Am I 50%? Have I fully explored my options? And then let's go with that decision. And it feels like people are going to make that somewhere between the next year to 2 years. And it's an active conversation right now.
Absolutely. Absolutely. VMware is a pillar of the enterprise data center, right?
Sure.
I mean, it's absolutely ubiquitous. Everybody runs it. And, what I compare it to is saying, what if somebody told you to get off of Windows? It's that level.
Yeah.
Right. And that's a tough conversation to have. And it's forcing I&O departments to have difficult conversations.
Yeah. Well,
right?
The other aspect of it, and you sort of, I think, even subconsciously mentioned it, like you said, I was a VMware engineer, right? And I think VMware for the longest time did such a good job of allowing people to make their career based around their technology, their certifications, their whatever. They weren't a virtualization engineer; they were a VMware engineer. And they now sort of have put those folks in an interesting situation. It'll be interesting to see how it plays out. Of, do you sort of say to yourself, okay, do I think there's a long tail future for this? Do I want to keep tying myself to it? Or do I have concerns if like my company sort of sours on it? Do I want to be part of the modernization thing? And how do I, kind of rebrand myself to be, important in that sense, which I think that those people are still going to be super, super important. But it is an interesting, like entirely human psychological aspect that's not so much just technology, that, is going to be interesting to watch how it plays out, because VMware had such a fervent community. I mean, people loved what they did, and now it's an interesting transition. Yeah,
absolutely.
I want to shift to something that I know you spend a ton of time on, not that you don't on VMware and cloud, but, around the technologies that get into things like automation and where teams work together and so forth. We've seen over the last decade so many technologies that have come out, things like Kubernetes and automation and obviously DevOps and platform engineering, and in which teams are sort of having to be forced to work together more, because the expectation from a business perspective is this technology is supposed to help make us more agile. It's supposed to help us move faster. And, for a long time, IT groups have been kind of siloed and so forth. Where in that space, in that moving faster, collaborative teams, platform engineering, DevOps, DevSecOps, like, how do you see the evolution of that in terms of, I guess, both technology, but maybe even more importantly, again, as you're talking to companies, how far do you think we are from this is what, platform engineering is supposed to look like, and this is what's actually getting implemented from a people and a process perspective?
That is an astute question, because there's a very big delta between the two, right? Yeah. Platform engineering is very hyped right now, and there's a lot of kind of term inflation. By the way, we at Gartner, we named platform engineering a top strategic technology trend in both 2023 and 2024. I led that research effort. So I guess Gartner and myself personally, we are as responsible for the hype as anyone. But yeah, a lot of people are trying to expand the definition of platform engineering to fit what they're already doing, right? Sure. And this happens all the time. We saw this happen with SRE. Google publishes a book on site reliability engineering. That term gains a lot of currency, and people basically start renaming their existing operations teams SREs without changing anything.
Sure. Yeah.
Right. And
we saw that with DevOps.
Exactly.
Sure. Yeah.
Exactly. And we're sitting here saying, no, Google has been very clear about this. SRE is a new model. They wrote a book about it. It's actually not a vague term at all. It means this very concrete thing. And, people don't want to hear that. So I do think there's a lot of people that are trying to jump on the platform engineering bandwagon. But something that's very important to me to point out is this is something that's new and different, right? And what's different about it is you are building a product. You are building an internal software product that is very finely tuned to an end user. Most likely a developer, maybe not necessarily a developer, but most likely a developer. The goal is enhancing that user's productivity, and you are building the tool that they need to do the job that they need to do, right?
Yeah.
And I say this all the time. In a lot of cases in automation, we're solving our own problems as ops, right? Somebody wants to stand up a virtual machine, and that takes me a long time. So I want to automate the process of building a virtual machine so I can turn that over to end users. But you're solving your problem as an operator, right? The problem that your developer has is they want to deploy code, and they probably don't want to deal with a virtual machine at all, right? So what you want to build for them is a quick way to deploy code.
Right. Sure.
And what that looks like is you're building an abstraction layer on top of your infrastructure, on top of your continuous delivery pipelines. Ideally, that would have its own proprietary APIs that you built, its own DSL that you built, and you would have your developers talking to that. So that would be a foundational abstraction for their code. It would be a load-bearing piece of their code. And it would roll up all of the complexities of infrastructure so that they don't need to know any of it. That's what platform engineering is.
Yeah, just as simple as that. hide all the complexities. Let the developers go as fast as possible.
Right.
Put the guardrails around it so they don't screw up the security or pull down bad code from the internet, and just all those things together. And,
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It's what we've been trying to do with DevOps for years.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's, yeah.
Yeah. It's an interesting thing. If you had to kind of give it a grade or what inning we're in, where do you see it? Obviously you and Gartner have been talking about it for a couple of years is super important. Are we first inning stuff? Are we, second inning stuff? Are we 20%? Where, if you had to take a swag at, where the mainstream is, maybe not like the best of the best or the best of the best of the, kind of the total extremes. So where do you think the mainstream is with that?
First inning, we're in batting practice right now.
Okay.
I would say most companies, right?
Yeah.
And obviously there are companies that I talk to that have very, very mature platform engineering practices. One of the nice things about working for Gartner is we talk to everybody, so you kind of see the full spectrum. I've had clients approach me and say, we've had a platform engineering team for years, and the feeling internally is that the work is done. So we're trying to justify the continued existence of a platform engineering team. Yeah. That is not a problem that the typical client has, right? What the typical client is dealing with is there's a ton of hype around this, precipitated by Backstage as well. The release of Backstage was a key component of this. There's a lot of interest in that. There's a lot of people that want to implement Backstage, and they want to come up with some kind of an MVP that they can produce that will provide value without being the full thing, right?
Yeah.
And I think you can do that with Backstage. I mean, if you set up a user self-service portal where somebody can log in and they can see a menu of items that are available to them, and they can click on that and have an automated fulfillment process behind it. And you can have documentation. Backstage is great as a documentation repository.
Sure.
That's something that you can turn over to a developer and say, go here. This is your one-stop shop. You can read all the documentation. You can learn about the best practices. When you want to stand up a development environment, you click this button and a development environment happens. That is, I would say, a low level of platform engineering maturity overall, but that's probably a huge improvement over what you have today.
Right.
And I think that is something that would be enormously valuable and something that you can do. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Well, and I think what you highlighted there, and it may not always seem obvious, is sometimes we would call that an MVP, but like you said, in a lot of cases, what was there before was a 3-month process just to sort of get things going, or a 3-week process to get from like laptop to, being able to push your first piece of code internal to some company. And so, sometimes we get these grand kind of ambitions of like, well, it could be 1,000 different things, but, kind of getting that first step of just like, oh, you just want to get started, and here's a thing with some guardrails, with some documentation, and it just works. Sometimes that is a monumental achievement and may solve 85-90% of the problem as it is, or at least make them much, much happier. So it'll be interesting. I think the really good thing is people seem to be pretty okay with Backstage. Obviously it's a complex piece of technology. It's got a lot of modularity, so it can be a lot of things, but I don't feel like there is, sort of the competitive equivalent to a Backstage coming from somewhere else. At least as a whole, we've kind of said, yeah, if that's a path we want to go down with an IDP and platform engineering, that seems to be the framework that everybody's like, yeah, we'll work in this world. We'll get through this in the ways we want to get through it.
Yeah, it makes a ton of sense, right? And that is something that does provide a lot of value to a lot of people. Yeah. What I say to people all the time is, you have a way to deploy code right now.
Sure.
Right. That's something that you're doing. And the advantage of having a centralized team that does this is that you are taking that burden away from all your development team. Because right now, you probably have one engineer on every development team who is dedicating their time to building pipelines and getting deployments right and doing all of that. And you know what? It's probably the best engineer on that team.
Sure.
It's probably the most senior, most process-driven, most dedicated person who has taken the time to build out all of these pipelines and really think through what should our deployments look like from a systemic perspective. So you're taking an engineer, maybe your best engineer, out of the value stream, right? Whatever software that team produces that is valuable to your business, you now have an engineer not doing that.
Yeah.
They're spending all the time, tinkering with cloud APIs and things like that. And that's not something you want to do as a business, right? The people that write the software that make us money, I don't want them doing anything else, right? Let me centralize this into a platform team and take that burden off of them. In a lot of ways, the real trend here is platform teams more so than platform engineering.
Interesting. Yeah. No, I hadn't really sort of broken it down and thought about it that way of like, yeah, you're oftentimes taking your best engineer because they understand the complexity, they understand the different systems, they're able to move quickly, and yeah, you're taking them out of the lineup and doing, I don't want to say non-productive work,
right.
but it's work that becomes very hard to immediately point at and go, oh, that thing created 7 more features that we're able to launch 2 new products and, make money and all that sort of stuff. So interesting. Yeah. Now that's, and yeah, I got to imagine once you start to realize that sort of stuff, the idea of like, let's start with some baseline framework that those things are just sort of done for us, makes a ton of sense for people.
Yeah.
I want to ask you one last question because we're rolling. We've been going for a while. I think it's been great conversation. So I appreciate all the depth and so forth. The adoption of automation. So you obviously cover this quite a bit. I feel like automation is kind of it's a weird conversation because we're still talking about it. We've seen, the major platforms that do automation go through different kinds of changes, whether it's Ansible or Terraform or Chef and Puppet or, homegrown things. And I feel like we've been living with sort of modern, frequently changing, agile environments for more than a decade. So you would think like automation should just automatically be there. Like you couldn't survive without it. And yet we still see so many islands of, well, yeah, we'll get around to automating that, eventually, but we're not there yet. Like what are the hard parts of automation that we're missing that keeps us from being like, yeah, you just have to do automation. It's just kind of part of what you do, as opposed to sort of all the excuses that people make about not automating everything.
Yes. At the same conference that I gave the public cloud is cheaper than your data center talk, I gave a talk called Infrastructure Automation, the Hard Parts. And both well received. I'm glad, nobody threw rotten vegetables at me on stage, which is good.
That's no fun. Yeah. You don't want that.
Exactly. But yeah, there are a lot of people who are hearing the automation message for the first time. Again, I'm speaking with a broad spectrum of companies in various different levels of maturity, and I will tell you, everybody is all over the map here. You do have companies that have automation practices in place. In many cases, I mean, there are people with the job title automation engineer or automation architect, right? There are people who have done high levels of automation, and they are running up against the limits of what's possible right now. They're on the bleeding edge, and they want to talk about a very cutting edge set of problems. And then, my next phone call will be somebody that's, we've been thinking about maybe writing some scripts,
Yeah.
And sometimes I want to say, what have you been doing for the past 10 years? Right. But I think in general, the level of automation in the data center and I&O generally is pretty low. Network automation in particular, I think there's very little automation in networks. Server automation, storage automation is probably a little bit more advanced, but maybe not much. And I feel like I do have a lot of automation 101 conversations, right?
Yeah.
If I say something like the goal is to extend CI and CD pipelines to infrastructure, one of the core tenets of CI and CD is that everything you do as part of this pipeline has a test associated with it. So your goal is to build a stage delivery pipeline with a test suite at every stage. That's something that should be absolutely basic, bog standard stuff. I mean, that is, that's continuous delivery 101. That is a message that a lot of people are hearing for the first time. Maybe on this podcast, you're hearing that message for the first time, right?
Sound the alarm, sound the air horn, so you're paying attention.
Exactly right. Exactly right. But that's, I think that's. I have been a little bit surprised at the lack of automation because, I mean, I do think it's absolutely central to everything that we do in enterprise IT. To your point.
Yeah.
And I don't know how you can get by without it at this point.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think the gaps between the those who are all in and those who haven't committed is probably continues to kind of grow. I have to think part of it has to go back to, and I kind of think back to my time, doing operation stuff and hands-on keyboard stuff. Like there was such a big gap between sort of a native thing you would do with a product, a storage array, a network device, a whatever, firewall. And then this sort of, it had its own sort of DSL, its own command line, its own tools. And then this sort of, here's this kind of programming language, DSL, again, whether it was, Chef's language or Puppet's language or Hashi's, framework or Ansible playbooks or whatever it is. And you were just like, that stuff just, yeah, you know what? I'll just type it out, or I'll just, or I'll, like you said, I'll write a script for it that I can do it. And I think that's part of it. I think people underestimate, and I think the newer generations have kind of come up through it, so it's not as much. But the generations that are, late 30s, 40s, 50s in the industry who are, super viable in terms of experience, kind of were able to come up, make a really good name for themselves, make a really good career, make good salaries, without having to sort of write code, if you will, let alone write tests, and then have to understand, what do developers do. And now it's all sort of merged together. So yeah, it does feel like we're probably at a tipping point where you don't have a choice anymore, right? If you're going to deploy AI, like you have to be doing stuff with automation because stuff will change quickly, and you're scaling stuff out and scaling it back because GPUs are expensive. But yeah, it's interesting. I'm gonna wrap us up there, only because for the sake of time, I want to be cautious to our listeners. You and I have been diving into stuff. I know even talking before the show, we said, hey, these topics are so sort of thick and deep. We could go for an hour on probably any of them. If folks want to dig into the stuff that you guys do, if they want to, speak to you, speak to your team, sort of understand, kind of this part of the conversation as opposed to, purely the sort of bits and bytes and kind of the bigger picture things. What are good places to engage with your team? Or I know you guys hold a big event every time in the fall. What are the best ways to sort of engage with the team?
Yes, I mentioned IOCS a couple of times and sort of didn't explain it. That is the Gartner IT Infrastructure Operations and Cloud Strategies Conference. That's where my team hangs out mostly. We do it in Las Vegas and London and Sydney. I will be in Las Vegas this year. It is December 10th through the 12th, and I will be with 4,500 of my closest friends. Attendees. So it's, infrastructure operations, cloud leaders, and we have a lot of technical folks there as well. We have some pretty good technical content that my team produces. So yeah, if you come to the conference, you can hear our talks. You can book a one-on-one with me where you can sit down with me or one of my colleagues for 30 minutes and just discuss your problems in particular.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the core of the company is our written research.
Sure. Absolutely. Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah. No, and I've been to the events, as I'll say this, as much as I enjoy talking to the analysts, when you get a chance to sit down with them, just the fact that you are around so many peers who are, kind of having to deal with problems at a level that you don't necessarily get from sort of vendor-led technical conferences where so much of it is sort of, let's just look at a new feature and dive into a new product. And just if you think about the last 40 minutes we've had of sort of the richness of conversation, it's economics, it's technology, it's organizational structure, it's thinking 3 or 4 years in the future. Those types of conversations are going on in the hallways with the analyst teams in the breakouts. So if you're starting to live in that world where that's the scope of what you've got to deal with, it's a really, really good use of your time and a really good way to network with people. And the nice folks at Gartner in allowing us to talk to Paul today have said, hey, if you're going to go, let's make it a little more tangible for you. So in the show notes, there will be a discount code to be able to, if you decide to go out to the event, if you're trying to get your boss to sign off on it, take a look in the show notes when this publishes. We'll have a discount code in there, save you a few bucks, maybe allow you to have a few dollars to go over to the Sphere or go do some fun stuff in Vegas. So, Paul, with that, I want to thank you so much for the conversation today. We dove into a lot. I learned a lot. I always like I said, I like to get perspective on how you help people rationalize these complicated problems. So thank you so much for everything today.
Well, thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Yeah. So with that, folks, again, we want to thank Paul for his time. Like I said, there's a number of things in his work that he's done that we'll put in the show notes that are good follow-ups if you want to dive into any of these topics. But with that, on behalf of Aaron and I want to thank Paul for his time. I want to thank him for the depth of knowledge. And with that, we'll wrap it up and we'll talk to you next week. And we are done, sir.
All right.
That was great.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.